Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about a Landsknecht Emporium model M5a Messer, which is on loan from sword friend Ian specifically for this review. And before I get into the nitty-gritty of the review, as I often do, I tell you some disclaimers. First and foremost, I'm not affiliated with Landsknecht Emporium. I didn't buy the sword. The sword wasn't sent to me from Landsknecht Emporium. We have no affiliation. The sword was sent to me from sword friend Ian, who would subsequently like the sword back in working order if at all possible. So I do have license to run it through its normal paces, things that you would normally use a cutting or sharp sword for, but not to abuse the sword, and we will talk about the rest of that in the review. Sword friend Ian did send it to me with the specific intention of reviewing it, but he didn't really say I have to say one thing or another. I have free reign to give you my thoughts and opinions, which I guess is par for the course on reviews. The last thing I should really note is that I am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on any type of swordsmanship, and I am not a student of historic European martial arts. I don't make any promises or apologies for knowing how to correctly use this sword. You should know I am a novice, so as you hear me say it swings one way or another, or I like this or that, just know I'm not a great student of history, not a practitioner of historic European martial arts, and you should take what I say with a grain of salt. Though hopefully the video provides you with enough video evidence, if you will, or enough information for you to make up your own mind on if this type of sword suits you. I don't necessarily have to be a practitioner of historic European martial arts or even know things to use a camera correctly to show you things that might be helpful in your buying decision. So that's what I'm going to do. Feel free to mute me if you'd like, but on with the show. So firstly, this sword in particular is based off the Landsknecht Emporium Falk M5a++ Kriegsmesser, which is 900 euros on their website. This particular one has been elongated slightly. It's also made for left-handed use, and it comes with a scabbard and byknives. We'll talk about each one of those pieces, but I am a right-handed person, so the fact that it's left-handed, I guess it doesn't really impede me that much, but it does mean that the nagel, the little shell bit on one side, is on the other side, and anyway, it's not a big deal. Now, because this is a custom piece, I can't really evaluate it against the weight or stats that are provided by Landsknecht Emporium. Given that this is a little longer and is a customized piece, I can't really tell you how close they hit the mark to advertise specs, because it is intentionally made to not advertise specs. What I will provide is dimensions and the weapon dynamics computer, both in the description down below and here, so that you can see the distal taper and all of that, but I'll cover it in greater detail in a moment. Many times I've noted I am not a great student of history, but I do have basic reading comprehension, and in the description of this product on Landsknecht Emporium's website, I can see that it is based off of a drawing or painting by somebody whose name I do not wish to massacre at this time, and I wasn't really able to find that painting or picture, and what I did find is this, and it looks remarkably similar, though I can't say for sure if this is what it was originally based off of. Fortunately for me, there's somebody else who's done a review and covered some of the historical aspects and done a little bit more of the heavy lifting, and that is Matt Easton from Scala Gladiatoria. I will put a link to his review in the description down below, though if you're watching this one, I'm assuming you've probably seen that one already, given he's a much more popular and knowledgeable gentleman than I am. In any respect, the information is included down below for his review, and I think he covers a lot more of the historical side of things. I'll touch on some of Matt Easton's points in this review, but in a nutshell, he's already done the heavy lifting for me. Now, it's currently April 2019, and it's really important for me to note that because the price point on the Landsknecht Emporium website is 900 euros, and to me that means a little over $1,000 based on the current exchange rate. Sword friend Ian paid roughly $1,600 for this sword, but that was through one, the Etsy shop, which is not the same as the Landsknecht Emporium website, and two, it has some customizations as well as a scabbard and byknives, which cost additional money. The 900 euro or roughly $1,000 version that I see on the website is presumably a more standard model without customizations, but also without a scabbard, and presumably without the Etsy markup, which may or may not exist. In any respect, I am looking at it from the lens of a $1,600 sword, and is it worth that or not? But you may also want to keep in mind that these retail for closer to $1,000 at this time if you don't get all the extra bells and whistles. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the grip, and there's really a lot to say about the grip, a lot of interesting stuff for something that really looks quite simplistic. First is the construction, and I don't want to talk about it too much because I can't validate it without ruining it. But it's supposed to be a hidden tang that's affixed with wooden pegs, and that's supposed to be a traditional thing, which I guess is historically accurate. I'm going to I'm going to trust that the people at Landsknecht Emporium and their various associates have done their research and that that is in fact a traditional thing, given that the sense of tradition and historical accuracy seems to be a big sticking point for people at Landsknecht Emporium and their prospective customers. So supposedly that's traditional, but I can't validate that it is or is not constructed that way. Anyway, it's an interesting point. The other bits to note are just the functionality of the grip and the overall construction. So shape-wise, we can see that it narrows towards the guard and swells out towards the base or the end of the grip. And there's no counterweight, there's no pommel there, but there is a swell at the end, which gives you some additional bits of control. The swell would both rest in the palm of your hand as well as where your pinkies might be. And if you tense your grip, if you flex your grip, it gives you some additional control to move the point around. And it's a very pleasant sensation in terms of just the overall shape. Shape-wise, aside from the taper that you can clearly see, is it's got like a hexagonal shape, which is elliptical somewhat. Obviously, it's not elliptical because it has flats on it, but it's not. It's very easy to index is the main point I'm driving at. It's really easy to find out where the edges, both by the proportionality of the blade and just how it rests in your hands, but the grip is also very easy to tell which direction the edge is supposed to be. It also has this kind of channel in it, which is dug in, and I don't know how traditional it is. This is a point where on the photos I couldn't tell if this is a channel that's dug in or not. It was tough for me to tell from the historical photo that this may or may not be based off of, given my very dodgy research. In any respect, it is a very comfortable feature, something I really like. I found that the tips of my fingers rested in this little swell quite easily, and it gave me this really tight grip on the blade. It really felt secure in my hand, which is a very comfortable one for a two-handed grip. It doesn't slip around. You might think that the leather would be slippery when wet. I didn't necessarily find that to be the case, though my hands were pretty dry, all things considered, though they got a little wet in the snow sometimes. I didn't find it to be slippery at all, though it gives me this really connected sensation when I hold it with a one-handed grip as well. It's a very functional grip. Your hand doesn't slip out given how it widens and gets larger. Your hand doesn't want to slip and slide out of your hand at all. I find it to be a very functional grip, very nicely done. The leather on it, admittedly, is not perfect. It has some characteristics that I would say aesthetically are not pleasing, though the aesthetics are rough, and I suppose this is the point that I can drive at, which will follow through the entirety of the blade, and a point that Matt Easton made, and this is the first spot that I'm addressing it, so I'll cover it as a larger topic, and that is that this sword has a very rugged medieval aesthetic. Now, Matt Easton's review pointed out that they've captured the medieval aesthetic by giving it kind of this handmade feel without being disproportionate or bad. It captures the way they're represented in historical museum pieces, but new. And I don't necessarily know that I agree with that. I don't know. I don't have the research background to say how much they've captured the medieval aesthetic or not, honestly. What I will say is that as I compare this to other less expensive mass-produced swords, I would typically ding a vendor for giving leather that has smudges, that has a seam on it that I think might come undone, that has hammer marks, that has a rugged aesthetic and a lack of fine polish. Now, I acknowledge that some people may really prefer this look, and I would say that it does have this kind of handmade feel to it that permeates almost every section of this blade. To some, it's a feature, and to some, it's a pretty big con in terms of lack of spit shine, especially given the price point. A lot of people expect the world for $1,000. Whether or not it's fair to is a different question. It's not, but the point is that there are some rough edges around here, some lack of perfection, some very handmade roughness that demonstrates that this is like a medieval style tool. Now, whether you think it captured the aesthetic or you think it's just rough and bad, hopefully the video provides you with some information to go either way. In any respect, the leather on here looks to be of a very good quality. However, there's lots of just imperfections, some blemishes from securing the leather or gluing it. The seam as well is not stitched. Now, Matt Easton noted that he thinks this would come undone, and one thing I noted is that he pointed to the seam on the edge side, as where this is on the palm side of the grip on this particular one. What I would note is that it doesn't seem to be loose. There's no lip or anything that is something that would kind of grab your palm and have friction. So if it is going to come undone, it will hopefully take a very long time to do so, though to his point, it does not appear to be stitched. It appears to be glued quite securely, but glued nonetheless, and maybe a point that that causes weakness, though I haven't seen this move in any of the amount of moving the sword that I have done, though I haven't done hundreds of repetitions over years and years and years. The leather is just imperfect. It has some blotches, some lack of areas where it's secured in the same way. I can make out some of the wood near one of the handle, near the top of the guard area. It's just not perfectly affixed to the sword, but overall I would say it's very well done, and it has a rugged look to it, and overall, I mean, just functionally as a grip, it's very good. Now I'm going to talk about the crossguard, and the first thing to note is this lack of symmetry on the quillins. So if I look at the side without the nail on it, it looks like there's a steeper step along the back side of the blade, the side that isn't sharpened, and the side that is sharpened has a gradual taper. Now on either side of the quillins, the transfer from this square shape to this hexagonal or octagonal shape isn't perfectly symmetrical. We'll chalk that up to the medieval aesthetic, if you will, that I talked about earlier, but it has a roughness to it. Anyway, the fact that it's intentionally not symmetrical makes me inherently more forgiving when I don't see symmetry. So the quillins gradually taper off from the square shape to an octagonal shape. They have some file markings towards the end, which again are not perfect, but look overall relatively crisp. The edges are chamfered, so there's no sharp spots on the edges of the quillins, which is great for me since I tend to bump my head with them. The nagel, or the nail, whichever it's called, this shell piece, is also affixed and peened by hand. Now, initially I thought that this was a crack, but it's actually just a deeper scratch of some sort. It doesn't appear to be cracked as I look at it very closely, but it does have a pretty steep scratch on it. Now, it came to me this way. I don't know if it was shipped that way. The scratch is rather unsightly and something that I would say is not necessarily part of the medieval aesthetic, and is just a blemish which should have been addressed. Anyway, the other things I'll note about the guard is that there are a lot of tooling marks, whether it be the peen on the nagel or the shell area. You can tell it's done by hand and kind of finished by hand. I make out tooling marks and general roughness and some small imperfections across, but overall it does have a charming look, and it seems very tight and very functional. One bit that I would draw your attention to, though, is where the guard meets the grip, and that is that I can make out the shoulders of the blade. Now, the shoulders of the blade are typically resting inside the crossguard. There's a cutout section that allows the smaller section of the tang to go through, and then the shoulders rest inside the crossguard. The crossguard is pushed up from the tang and often friction fit if it's done well, or at least in what I understand to be well. Here I can make out the shoulders poking out underneath the base of the guard, which is an odd thing to me. It makes me think maybe the guard was slid down the blade rather than up from the tang. I don't know. However, what I will say is that the sword tang feels quite well fit. The guard isn't wiggly at all, and the gap between the blade and the guard seems to be of reasonable proportion. It's obviously larger than you would see on like an Albion or something like that, but for hand fit, it seems overall quite good. It is just unsightly to see the shoulders of the blade underneath the guard, though you're not necessarily looking there very often. And there's also a slight ledge on one side. It makes me think they've been kind of hammered down or something like, well, obviously I can see it's been hammered down. It's been beaten quite a bit. But there's a slight ledge here that I can catch my finger on. It didn't cause me any discomfort in use. Even if I was choking up on the guard, it didn't scratch any of my skin off. But it's just an unsightly, kind of odd thing to see. Otherwise, the overall guard is tight. Nothing has come loose. It didn't rattle or anything like that. And so however they've assembled it, it's certainly doing its job correctly. Now I'll talk about the scabbard, which maybe deserves its own video. And in honesty, there's a lot of interesting stuff about this scabbard, but I'm going to just start with the things that I don't like. So first, the seam along the back appears to be just glued. It's along the back. You're not necessarily going to see it if it's resting and facing you. And overall, I mean, it's not the worst, but I make out little spots of wood or little bits underneath it that are just unsightly. Also, it has lots of just imperfections, pings and dings and tooling marks and things like that. It's far from pristine, but it has a kind of a rugged, used charm, and I'm thinking it kind of came this way out of the box, but Sword Friend Ian may have used it some. I don't believe so, though. I think it's just capturing the medieval aesthetic again. The other bit that I noticed is as I'm drawing the sword, it constantly makes a scraping sound. This is not like a European katana in the sense that you can draw it quickly and effectively and easily the same way you would a katana. The scabbard does not work the same way a katana-style scabbard was. It doesn't glide along the inside like it's on rails. It doesn't, it draws silently. At least I was unable to effectively do that. It doesn't, well, maybe it's my lack of practice, but it doesn't slide back in the same way. It's definitely a different thing than a katana, and it's supposed to be. However, I would just say that the scabbard has a very nice look to it. Functionally wise, though, it's a little noisy and just a little imperfect in its overall execution. One other bit that I would note is that one side, one side of the scabbard seems to have some felt stuck in it. So as you would wear the scabbard, it has a section where maybe the tip won't poke through the wood or something like that. Or I'm not sure exactly why, but one side appears to be fitted with a felt pad. I'm not sure if that's traditional or not. The mouth of the scabbard has also got leather over it. That's a detail that I think is often missed in scabbards, where sometimes they just don't put the leather all the way over to the top, and it appears to be covered here. Though on the inside I can kind of make out gluing and some tooling and things like that. It's just a little rough around the edges. I do like this braided section where the belt is fixed. I also like the color discrepancy between, or the color contrast between this kind of yellow leather and the black. It has what this wavy leather embellishment in the scabbard next to where the byknives are. And that's another little bit, the byknives. They come with two little byknives that have a more conventional messer hilt on them with rivets that go through them, and then a little brass section. They're very sharp and overall quite decent, though they're not perfect. They also have a roughness to them. They look like a functional tool, though. I mean, this is a roughness that I wouldn't necessarily mind using, but they're far from pristine, beautiful knives. They look like good little tools to cut your steak with, though. Anyway, considering that this scabbard, I believe, is 350 euros with the byknives, the fact that you get two little custom knives that have the same handmade aesthetic in it, I think is actually quite a deal. It would be pretty easy to spend the same amount of money on just a wooden scabbard without any of the embellishments, without the byknives, without the pockets to hold the byknives, without the felt pad. I mean, overall, the price that you pay for the scabbard seems very reasonable. Now, I might gripe and moan about some of the aesthetic embellishments, though. If you're buying something from Landsknecht Emporium, it seems like you probably appreciate the aesthetic rather than want to bitch about it. In any case, I overall like the scabbard, and I like these two little byknives. It seems very characteristic of a messer scabbard, and I'm glad that sword friend Ian was able to send me this, because it's a fun look at something I haven't gotten a chance to play with before, these byknives. Now, the sword does come out of the scabbard if you tip it upside down, though not quickly. The byknives are very securely affixed in there, though. They push in and are friction fit in such a way that they do not move easily. You can almost draw them an inch out and they still won't move from the scabbard. At least they won't fall out as you're just walking around, or even if you're tipping the sword or scabbard upside down. Now we will talk about the blade, and there are some interesting things. Just general shape-wise from the blade, it's very wide and relatively thin on this section here. The distal taper is not terribly pronounced. It has a gradual distal taper and then begins to thin out ever more significantly once the fuller section has passed, though I wouldn't call it a drastic taper really on either direction or any way you look at it. There's not a significant taper. One thing that I will note is that it has fullers that run on both sides. They terminate really in different ways and in different spots, so it's not perfect in that regard. And the curvature of the blade is really not all that significant until you get out to the tip. It's really the tip that makes the curve so significant. It appears to not curve all that much until you just include this tip section, and that's what really makes it quite a bit more pronounced. Sharpness on the blade has a significant secondary bevel. It obviously has some geometry that brings that bevel section in, but there is a very pronounced secondary bevel and also a very, very keen edge. For bouncing around on a scabbard, across the pond and then across the country in the U.S. here, the edge is really quite sharp, and good on you there, because I've had plenty of European style swords that are far from this level of edge. It could be sharper, but overall I would say it's got a very, very good edge on it. Polish-wise, there are imperfections, and I don't know if I would say the polishing imperfections are from tooling, from maybe being in the scabbard and bouncing around, and something that we would call saya rub in the katana world, but scabbard rub, if you will. If it's from use, I'm not sure, but in any case, the main point is this kind of satin finish is such that you don't necessarily mind using it. It blemishes easy, but it also corrects easy with some steel wool or some sandpaper. It's easy to get this level of finish out, even if you lack the dexterity to do most things like I do. The blade itself is 33 inches long. That's close to 84 centimeters. The one on Landsknecht Emporium is advertised as around 74, 73 centimeters. So this one is a little bit longer. I'm not sure how that impacts the curve, given that this last few inches over here is what really is making the curve much more pronounced. Anyway, the additional length doesn't make it feel bad at all. Now, dynamically speaking, and in terms of measurements, I'm going to include all those in the description down below. But dynamically speaking, what I'll say is Matt Easton noted that it felt kind of like a katana. I don't think it really feels like a katana. I guess it feels more like a katana than a longsword does, but it doesn't feel quite the same in my hands as a katana does. There's a lot more to it, though, than just the weight distribution, the grip. How it just moves in my hands. It doesn't feel the same way a katana does. He also noted that it's relatively rigid, and it is more rigid again than a longsword, but much less rigid than a katana. It has quite a bit more wiggle than that. In any case, it moves quite well. I don't mind moving it at all. It has a very pleasant sound as it moves around. I find it to be quite easy. I feel very connected to the sword is part of the reason. These quillins are something I'm not terribly used to moving around. The nagal area, me using it right-handed, even though it's a left-handed piece, doesn't really bother me. I'm used to having a suba or something round around my hand to not whack my head into. These large head whackers, quillins, are pieces that are odd for me to move. I'm not used to them. But the sword moves really well. I feel like it indexes really well. It doesn't want to turn in my hand. I feel extremely connected to it, and that part is very, very comfortable to move around. I found it to be an extremely easy piece to move. Drawing it out of the scabbard and trying to use it like a katana isn't the right thing to do, because it's not. But I did find it to be a very comfortable piece to move around. Cutting wise and use is a little bit of a different story. Now there's a couple caveats here. Water bottles, things like that, it really worked quite well on. I've done a couple cutting sessions with this sword, and it just has some variation in its overall usage. Though I will note that I'm testing it on pretty cold days. It's since warmed up some, but I tested it originally on very, very cold days, and the tatami mats were probably harder than they typically would be if you don't use them in a frozen tundra environment. Cutting through water bottles, this sword seemed to work really well, but water bottles aren't really much of a test medium. They help your edge alignment, or they tell you if you're doing stuff right, and the water bottles I cut told me I wasn't. Anyway, I moved on to some tatami mats, and that's where I really struggled to get this thing through a tatami mat. If I really put a lot of gusto into it, it would, but it didn't cut as easy as other swords would. And given its kind of cutting profile, this wide, thin blade with a really keen edge, I expected it to perform better than it did. Just bear in mind that I am cutting used Japanese tatami mats that are partially frozen. It's a real bitch of a target to try and cut through. While it did not perform as good as I expected it to, it certainly didn't perform bad, given that I'm unfamiliar with the sword, the targets are very hard, and I don't know what I'm doing. Now's the part of the review where I answer the question, do I personally think this sword is worth it or not? In my mind, I'm looking at it as a $1,600 sword that comes with some customization options on it, that also comes with a scabbard with 2 custom knives. So as I look at it, do I think it's worth it? Now, from your lens, you may want to think about it as about a $1,000 sword or a 900 euro sword, because that's what just this piece would cost you if you didn't get any customization options. So anyway, as I move on from there, the short answer is yes. I don't know if it's as an emphatic a yes as Mr. Easton put out there. We're right at the get-go of his video. He said, yes, absolutely, go buy one immediately. However, I do think there is a lot of value that's presented here. So first off, as I look at a $1,600 sword, well, it's tough to honestly find a messer. There are other messers available, either from Cold Steel. Albion made one, though I don't know that you can necessarily get that one anymore, and it was certainly more expensive than this just for the sword by itself. But it's not a well-populated section of the market. If you're looking for a Kriegsmesser, it's tough to find one. If you're looking for a messer in general, it's tough to find one. Though there are options out there. There are other custom makers that make falchions or something similar, perhaps in shape to this. But if you're looking for a Kriegsmesser, really, you don't have a ton of options available to you. Now, if you want this one in particular, I think a quasi-handmade object for $1,000 is not necessarily bad, given the time, energy, expertise, and all that type of stuff that goes into making this sword. But to come with a nice leather scabbard, 2 custom knives, and some customization options to boot is honestly overall a pretty good value. It's tough to find something that is equivalent, something that would, one, be a Kriegsmesser. It's tough to find something that gives you the options for customization, even at a higher price point, and also comes with a scabbard with 2 byknives. It's a tough thing to even compare anything to, given the lack of other options on the market. But if there were other options on the market, $1,600 still seems like quite a deal. The difference is, if you really have to appreciate this medieval aesthetic. Again, the medieval, the kind of handcrafted, lack of perfection, symmetry, roughness just permeates every facet of this sword. Everywhere you look, there's a small imperfection. It's not anything but cosmetic. It certainly functions really well, which hopefully the video demonstrated, but it's imperfect. And if that's something where you're too anal retentive, you want something that has very clean transfers and clean mirror polishes, and everything has to have a level of spit shine and symmetry to it that this doesn't, well, you're going to get really irritated really quickly. However, it's tough to expect that for $1,600. It's tough to expect that for $20,000. The main point is, if that's what you're looking for, I think you're going to be disappointed. I don't think you'll be disappointed in the performance or dynamics of this sword, or how it moves or feels in your hand, but if that type of detail is something you find irritating, you would certainly find a lot to be irritated by in this sword. Overall, though, if you're just looking for a sharp, nice messer, if you're looking for something with customization options, I'm very impressed with the sword. It feels fantastic in the hand, and there's really a lot to like about it. Anyway, that's really all I have for you. Special thanks again to sword friend Ian for sending me this sword for the purposes of review. Special thanks to Mr. Easton for doing all the heavy lifting for me already. Again, his video is in the link in the description down below. And that is all I have for you. As always, cheers, and thanks for watching.